Hey everyone, so Escoffier is coming out very soon and we've got some early access footage. She is insane. I don't know what else to say, to be honest. Actually, I do know what to say because today I'll be going over exactly how her kit works, what makes her so strong, how you can play her, and the various different advice that we can give, where she works well, where she doesn't work well, how strong her buffs are, her weapon is. This is some C0 gameplay. You can see it is very interesting. Ayaka's doing a lot of damage here, but the team in general is doing a lot of damage. You need to pay attention to. The team single target damage looks very nice, destroying this enemy, which you might have been struggling with on your previous Ayaka team. But if you thought this is impressive, this is just C0 gameplay. Wait till I show you what C6 gameplay looks like. And just wait for it, guys. Just wait for it. Instant damage. You can't even tell what was going on. There's just so much cryo. Let's do that in slow motion again. Try and see all the cryo damage. There's damage from Ayaka, damage from Shenhe, Escoffier's damage as well. Yeah, it's just hard to tell what's going on. And yeah, just a reminder, all the footage is coming from the CN early access videos. That's just how you're going to get the access to the best information, because unfortunately these days the CN players are the only ones who really get to do the thorough testing, the abyss testing and everything. So how do you summarize Escoffier's kit? You can say she's a powerful debuffer, a powerful sub DPS, and a very good healer. More specifically, her overall team buffs are very similar to what you'd get with Kazuha or Shilonen. Her sub DPS is up there with some of the strongest sub DPSs in the game. She covers the healing slot, but her healing ranges depending on your build, which we'll get into. And her overall advantages is that this support and this sub DPS is constant. It's very sustained and she has no downtime. But the restriction is her teams to get these effects are basically locked to only playing with Cryo and Hydro teammates. And by that, we mean that she has very similar restriction to how Chevreuse gets the majority of her value when you're specifically playing her with Pyro and Electro. Kinda similar as well to how Nilou only gets her full benefits when she's played with only Dendro and Hydro. So like how a Chevreuse team might look like this, for example, an Escoffier team won't work with someone like Kazuha here, but instead you have to play teams with just Cryo and Hydro, or there could also be worlds where you just play a team with 4 cryos. So let's get into her kit. So the easiest way to understand what her skill does is it's like sub DPS, like Emily, Farina, those kinds of characters. And it's this little pot that follows you around. And it has 20 seconds uptime with a 15 seconds cooldown. And you can see here, it's kind of single target, but the range is very nice. However, that's not to say it doesn't have some AoE. You can see here, if enemies are decently grouped, you can hit both at the same time. Let me just slow that down. Like this range here is not bad, hitting both enemies with that. So like for example, how Hu Tao's charge attack can sometimes hit 2 enemies, but that is very different from how Yoimi's bow attacks can basically never hit 2 enemies. The sub DPS hits, you're also getting about 21 hits in 20 seconds. So basically 1 hit every second. And you can see there, unbuffed damage 15k with a pretty decent build. This is the maximum range of your Escoffier hits as well, which is very good actually. I did actually want to compare this, so I was comparing with Emily and Chiori to see the range and the damage. So in comparison, here's me showing Emily's damage in a burning team. This is her with Deepwood, by the way. But you can see her damage is kind of similar, maybe kind of even weaker, to be honest. And then if looking at the ranges, this is my Chiori with her C1. And it is very similar, but bear in mind that Chiori C1 has increased range by 50%, and if you compare it with Emily's skill at a similar range, you're just not going to be hitting with Emily's skill at all. And Emily's skill has decent range, by the way. It's got no joke either, but you can see Escoffier is kind of just the best of both worlds. That was her elemental skill. Now if you look at her elemental burst, it's got a very nice animation and it has an initial pretty nice hit. And then it heals your team with a very nice AoE team-wide heal. And then it gives you 9 ticks of healing on your on-field DPS. So that's very important to know. She doesn't have constant AoE team-wide healing. It's just that first initial tick. You can see the 8,000 and then 3,000 to your on-field DPS. But it is important to remember, even if she doesn't have constant AoE team-wide healing, her fully healing your on-field character can activate Farina's A1 talent here, which gives a bit of extra team-wide healing. This healing scales off of Escoffier's attack, which means you have to figure out how you want to balance Escoffier's damage with crit stats and cryo damage stats, or building her for attack and getting a bit less damage on her but nice healing. And I think the overall recommendation might actually be just to build her for as much damage as possible. Here's some comparisons with the different builds and the different amounts of healing that you get. So with a rough build like this, C0 with her signature weapon, you're getting about 8,000 for your initial team-wide heal and then 3,300 for your on-field character. If you change that to an attack cup, the healing is quite a bit better. If you don't have a signature weapon and you have a cryo goblet, the healing will drop quite a bit. But overall, regardless of which one you pick, the healing is still very nice. Now, in my opinion, if you have the choice, what should you pick? The thing is, the cryo damage goblet is slightly more optimal because Escoffier's damage is just so relevant in these teams. And on top of that, the cryo damage goblet, you can actually get attack percent substats in your actual piece itself, which means it has a higher ceiling. Whereas if you're using an attack goblet, yes, your healing is probably slightly better, but you cannot get attack percent in the actual substats itself, meaning your artifact is less likely to be as good. Now, having said that, attack goblets are going to be more common than cryo damage goblets, especially if you're trying to get one on set, like this, for example. So use what you have, but that is just my experience. Personally, I'm going to be using this one here. So that was her sub DPS with her skill, her healing with her burst. Now this is maybe even more important, which is her talent. Now, if you remember in my previous video, we were speculating just how much resistance shred would she be giving. And now it's been revealed, if you're playing her in a team full of cryo and hydro teammates, it can reach a massive 55% resistance shred, which is insane, right? This is a lot bigger than what Chevrus gives. Chevrus gives 40%. But honestly, this 55% is actually very easily explainable. If you're only playing 3 hydro and cryo, you get 15%. So playing one more hydro or cryo gives you 40% more shred. And what else gives you 40% shred is, instead of that final freeze teammate, if you play an Anemo teammate like Kazuha, and then you get 40% here. So the logic behind this and why this number is so high is because it makes up for the fact that you're not playing that Anemo character in your 4th slot. Now, does that mean that Escoffier's buffing is equal to your Kazuha's? Well, no, actually, because there's stipulations around this shred here, which is that you have to switch in your Kazuha or your other Anemo character every 10 seconds. And you have to switch in every time a new enemy spawns in, because it's a debuff that is conditional on them swirling. Whereas how Escoffier's one works is that all you have to do is hit enemies with either her skill or the burst, and then you get 12 seconds of this shred, which basically means she gives your freeze team a permanent 55% resistance shred, which is massive. It's massive quality of life. It's very easy to navigate around, very easy to use. You're not gonna have any issues getting this debuff. And her last talent, this is actually where her single target healing comes from. It's 138% of her attack, which is very interesting that they decided to do this, because usually healers, they have their healing in one of their talents, like Charlotte has her healing in her burst, which means you can actually improve their healing by leveling it up. But with Escoffier's single target healing, it's always going to be this number. So how much sub DPS is she actually able to do with her skill? So this is with level 9 talents, C0, and with the R1 deathmatch. It's a decent build, nothing too crazy. It uses 4-piece golden troop to boost her skill damage, and these are the stats. And you're getting about 12k hits. Now, if you're using a signature weapon instead, your damage is increased to 18k, which means her weapon is giving about a 30% increase over a deathmatch. Now, there are some weapon comparisons here. It depends on your exact build, it depends on the exact team you're playing, and we'll get into what her weapon does exactly later. But yeah, it is a massive increase. In fact, one of the issues with polearms, and this is also an issue with shenhe as well, is that there isn't really that many good 4-star options. There's a lot of 5-star weapons which aren't even going to compare to her signature weapon either. But once you get into the 4 stars, if you don't have the deathmatch, if you don't buy the battle pass, you're really struggling for weapons to use here. And yeah, ideally you don't really want to use Fav Lance, because although this is a nice support weapon, Escoffier is a sub DPS and her damage will be a lot worse. It's very similar to the issue with Emily, Some people were having to run Favonius Lance, and that damage is horrible. There's stuff like Wave Breaker's Fin and the Catch, but this is for burst damage, not skill damage. So these skill damage sub DPSs, it is really a struggle trying to find a good weapon for them. Now let's see how big our Red Shred is. This is Garnu's raw damage. This Garnu is hitting for 18k charge attacks. That is without any buffs. Now if you use Escoffier's skill to apply the 55% Red Shred, Garnu's charge attack now goes up to a 25k hit, which is a 36% increase. On top of that, in your team, you're likely to have an attack buff somewhere. For example, I highly recommend a Tenacity of the Millilith set on your Farina if you're playing Farina in these teams. 20% attack to the team, and Farina can also benefit from this HP as well. You could also be using Noblesse on someone. So if you add the 20% attack on top of that somewhere, this goes into 47%. So getting a 20% attack buff somewhere, you're getting an extra 8% damage, 27 to 25%. So these teams, it's quite easy to stack a lot of buffs, but it's not over yet. Like I said, we haven't gone into the specifics around Escoffier's weapon, but if you are using Escoffier's signature weapon, you get an even bigger increase. Look at that, 30k charge attacks. And this is pretty consistent. You will see Escoffier's weapon is about an 11% increase to your on-field character. Again, we'll get into exactly what the weapon does later, but as you can see, there are a lot of buffs in these teams. Just for comparison, you can see the buffs that Kazuha would give in a team. So with his 40% damage bonus and res shred, he's increasing Garnu's damage there by about similar to what you'd get from Escoffier's res shred and the tenacity buff. But again, like I said, Escoffier's buffs that you get in a team like this are almost permanent, whereas buffs in another team can be comparable, but there are a lot more restrictions. Just to demonstrate how strong Escoffier is, here's her plus Xingqiu, who obviously doesn't do that much in freeze teams, versus Kazuha and Chilonen. So a full-on hyper carry Ayaka single target versus Escoffier plus Xingqiu, and you can see that the damage on the new team is just better, and Xingqiu is kind of like a dead slot in these teams. So the elephant in the room, you might be thinking Escoffier has top tier sub DPS, top tier support buffs, top tier healing. How is she able to be this good? How is that even balanced? And the thing is, on the surface, it might not seem balanced because she basically does everything. Like I said, she's doing the damage that my Emily or Chiuri would be doing, but those characters don't have any support. And she's doing the support that your Kazuha or Chilonen would have, but she's actually dealing very strong sub DPS on top of that. And that's not even getting into the fact that she's a good healer as well. But I think what I've realized is that recently the game has been trending to where it wants you to play specific cores. And I think within that, Escoffier does actually seem pretty well balanced. She is very strong, but it's not unreasonably strong. Because if you think about it, a lot of what she does is actually not that much different than what Chevreuse does. Chevreuse gives you the red shred, less than Escoffier, true, but Chevreuse is also giving you a massive attack buff up to 40%. On top of that, Chevreuse can even give you up to 60% damage bonus as well. She's not the best healer, you know, your teams can die quite often, but it is still healing nonetheless. And technically you also can build her for damage, although this kind of contradicts because her damage scales off attack stats, whereas you want to be building her with HP stats. Still, I think of it like a core. If you want to play your Electro DPS, then they really want you to be playing a Chevreuse. All these teams have very similar cores. They have your Chevreuse and they have a very strong buffer like Ian-san or Kujo Sara. That is the core for Electro DPSs and some Pyro DPSs. But for Pyro DPSs, there is also the Melt core. And Bennett gives massive buffs. And Citlali also gives massive buffs and enables the Melt reaction, which gives even more buffs to your DPS. And that is a very powerful core that they want you to play as well. So my logic is that Escoffier is just another one of these strong core teammates. Because if you think about it, Freeze doesn't really have a core before this. And it's weaker at a baseline because if you think about it, the actual reaction itself, Freeze doesn't actually do any extra damage. And a lot of the time, especially against bosses, it barely even works. In fact, it doesn't work. And then on top of that, if you're unable to get Freeze, then you're losing a lot of damage. You're losing the buffs that you get from Blizzard Strayer. A lot of these enemies, if you weren't able to swirl, it means you're not able to get Kazuha's VV. You're not able to get his damage bonus. And you might not even be getting cryo res. So you could lose 15% crit rate, maybe even 40% crit rate. You're losing 55% crit rate at times, on top of massive damage bonus and shred. So now if you think about it, Escoffier is almost like a fix to the reaction. It's fixing the issues where you are punished if you aren't able to freeze the enemies, because you're always getting her shred. And a sub DPS, you could kind of think about it like it's making up for the fact that freeze doesn't do any damage. Now obviously there are massive issues around these freeze teams, and like I talked about in my previous video, cryo characters are just so rare. Look at Shenhe, she barely even reruns. Even the cryo DPSs, they barely run as well. And on top of that, some of the characters like Ayaka doesn't have good synergy with a lot of cryo or hydro characters. So the issue is that you're forced into very specific premium teams. And for example, if you don't have Shenhe and you want to play your Ayaka, well, you're really lacking then, because there isn't that many other options. Like there's Seatlali that you can play, and Seatlali can technically hold the scroll set, and she could technically hold TTDS, but very conveniently, like I said, you could argue she was designed for the melt core, meaning she doesn't actually give cryo res shred here. But Seatlali is still a 5-star, so if you don't have Seatlali, who do you play then? Well, then you're looking at characters like Rosaria, Kaya, maybe even Diona, and then it's just very rough.
Strike a pose! Time to shine! Obey! By ordinance divine! Whirling snow! Sakura swirl!
25k hits. So Seatlali has scrolls and TTDS. And a shield, obviously.
Let the world collide! Get to work! Yes! Suffer the wrath! Yes! My apologies! Kami-san Sometsu!
The damage for Ayaka is very similar,
Take flight! Manifest! Show no
excluding the
mercy.
quills. But because let's not get it twisted, Shenhe is insane in these teams. Shenhe was pretty good before, but the thing is, a lot of these new freeze teams are triple cryo teams, which means usually her strength was based around the fact that only 2 of your teammates would be activating quills. But in triple cryo teams, you're getting 3 genuine cryo damage dealers, which means Shenhe's value's even higher. On top of that, it seems that the meta might actually be a mix set, because usually people used to play Noblesse. Her quills scale off of attack, but Noblesse also gives you attack and it buffs your DPS as well, so that worked out very efficiently. And before, mix sets used to be pretty competitive. Usually Noblesse was better, but now that you can proc even more quills in triple cryo teams, and a lot of the gameplay I have seen, it does seem to be the case where the meta is mixed, which means you're getting even more damage from your quills. On top of that, triple cryo means Shenhe has less energy issues, which means you don't need to stack a lot of energy recharge, which means in a way you're potentially swapping an entire Sand's worth of energy recharge into attack for even more quill damage. On top of that, if you're lucky and you manage to get her C1, this C1 is even stronger. She is way more efficient than how she used to be in these teams. And on top of that, it's even better, because triple cryo also reduces the energy recharge needs on your DPS, which means they need less ER, which means they can get more crit stats. And the more crit stats your DPS has, the more crit stats that the quills can scale on, which means the quills get extra stronger. I'm very interested in calculating just exactly how much value you're getting from Shenhe, but all those things must compound into massive increases from before. But like I said, it doesn't matter how strong she is if you don't have her. So that is one of the big issues with these teams. Here's the YS Helper character ownership rankings, which again is not every single player who plays the game, but it's a good indication of how characters are owned amongst players who are doing the Abyss. And as you can see here, Shenhe is not that popular at all. Even Seatlali's ownership is almost double, and she just came out. But having said that, this Shenhe ownership is amongst the whole player base that entered in this survey. It might be the case where amongst people who own Ayaka and people who play Ayaka, people who play Ganyu, Shenhe's ownership is higher. But again, this is just statistics. It's more important whether you yourself have Shenhe Or if you don't have Shenhe, if you have characters like Yelan, although again, Yelan works more for characters like Risley or Ayato, you wouldn't really play her with Ganyu. Now those were the obvious DPSs. There is this kind of meme going around. And it's playing neuvillette in a freeze team and seeing if he actually gets a new team. This seems to be a popular discussion in both China and the global regions. And the reason why this is interesting is because neuvillette is designed to be played with multiple elements in his teams, and that's because of this draconic stack thing. But if you're playing him in a freeze team, you're only having hydro and cryo, which means your stacks are going to drop potentially to even 110%. Now this is a final multiplier, which means it's a direct multiplier on his charge attacks, which means the damage drop off is massive. And why he has that talent is basically to nerf his synergy with Farina, because Farina's synergy is so good with him, and also Farina benefits from all the same buffs that he does, which means both their damage goes up. So the game developers realized in order to sort of weaken that synergy, it meant if you're playing with Farina, you go from doing 160% to 125%. Now obviously, as we know, neuvillette C1 is incredibly popular. In fact, in the usage rate surveys, more people have his C1 than have his C0. Obviously, that's not the entire player base, but it's a good indication about how popular C1 is. And the C1 gives you a free draconic stack, and the main benefit for that is so you don't lose by playing Farina. But the issue is, if you're playing 2 cryos, if you have his C1, it's even more punishing than normal. But even so, you're still getting a lot of buffs in this team, so how does it really compare? And on top of that, Farina doesn't have the draconic stack restriction herself, so she's just getting buffs in this team. So how does the damage compare? Well, what we've learned is neuvillette basically always does less damage. If you have a C0, he's doing slightly less damage, and if you have C1, he's definitely doing a lot less damage. So you can see there is quite a big damage loss, even with Bennett not doing anything in this team. He's just there for activating the draconic stacks. But that is just neuvillette's personal damage. If you look at the whole team's damage, because the rest of the team is just benefiting from freeze, it's actually very comparable. And the reason why it's comparable is, like I said earlier in the guide, Escoffier's res shred and her sub DPS is permanent. There's no downtime. Whereas teammates like Kazuha, Shilonen, even Vape teams, there is going to be downtime in your buffs and debuffs. So what does it mean overall? It means these new freeze teams actually theoretically can be very slightly higher DPS than neuvillette's old hypercarry teams at C0. However, do I recommend putting Escoffier for your neuvillette? No. Why? Because we haven't gotten into the drawbacks yet, and there are many drawbacks. Number one is that neuvillette's damage is very hingent on the builds that you have. You get a lot of extra crit in this team, meaning you have to build around getting 15% extra crit from cryo resonance. And we know it's very easy for neuvillette to have too much crit rate. I have only a small amount of crit rate in my artifacts, and once you add the 36% from Marechaussee Hunter, I'm at 86% here myself, which means if I'm playing him in a cryo team, I'm going to overcap. On top of that, I have his signature weapon, and you won't even be able to play the battle pass weapon if you have it, because the battle pass weapon will obviously give way too much crit. So in order to not lose too much damage, you'll need to adjust your builds and reduce your crit rate, while still having the same good level build. The other issue is that this team basically caps out at C0 with 4-star weapons. Like I said, neuvillette, you can't really use the battle pass weapon. Same thing with Escoffier, because, and this is where we get into her vertical investment, her weapon is amazing. What it does is it basically has Staff of Homer level stats. It's high base attack with 66% crit damage. Instead of giving you the flat attack from Staff of Homer, it gives you 24%. Which can actually equal more than Staff of Homer. And then on top of that, if your polearm character is a healer, then whenever they heal, you get 32% attack to the wielder and to the character they healed, which is insane for most teams, because those attack buffs, you'll be buffing your Shenhe's quills because you're increasing Shenhe's attack, and also your cryo DPS. However, the neuvillette team doesn't scale with attack, which means your Farina and your neuvillette are not going to be getting bossed. On top of that, Escoffier's constellations are very much oriented around cryo DPSs. We're not going to get into all of them, but just getting into the C1, her C1 increases your team's cryo crit damage by 60%. Again, neuvillette and Farina are not going to be able to benefit from that. Another disadvantage, and this is a very important one, is that you're not really playing into neuvillette's strengths. With characters like neuvillette who have such good quality of life, you know, with his massive AoE and his range, the more you buff neuvillette, the more you're playing into those strengths. Like just for an example here, all of this stuff here that I'm getting and I'm just destroying everyone, the more you buff neuvillette's damage, the more you're able to abuse that. So with strong characters like this, you really want to play into their strengths, and the freeze teams don't really do that. Which means the freeze teams are more single target orientated, which is again a massive weakness. Also, let's not forget, but this team is actually very specific. It's actually more of an Exodia team than a hypercarry team like this. Because if you're playing neuvillette as a hypercarry, to be fair, you could play him with almost anyone as long as they're buffing his damage. Whereas a team like this is very specific. It is basically these 4 characters. Why is that? It's because neuvillette doesn't really have good synergy with cryo characters. To be fair, a lot of people play him with Charlotte at the moment, but that's just for her healing. If you're looking at buffs, what Seat Lally does, she's obviously giving you this res shred, which means if you don't have Seat Lally, then your Escoffier for neuvillette team is having a massive damage loss. Lastly, and I made this video 4 months ago, neuvillette upgrade order priority. What this all means is there are dozens of things that you could get instead of getting Escoffier that will always be a damage increase for him. But even though I don't recommend you going out of your way to pull Escoffier for neuvillette, I still think these teams are options if you already have Escoffier, and if you want to mix it up, if you want to experiment with some teams, if you want a nice, chill, comfortable team, and if you just want to have more flexibility with your neuvillette, you sometimes want to play this team or that team, then it is an option. Back to our weapon though, because this presents an interesting discussion because of just how strong this weapon is, and it's actually kind of universal, even if we just ignore the support part first. Like I said, it's very similar to Staff of Homer. So if we look at Staff of Homer on my Emily, the base attack and crit damage are the same, but you get the attack bonus 0.8% of your HP. If I calculate 23152 HP times 0.008, she's getting 185 flat attack with this. But what Escoffier's weapon is you get 12% attack, and then if your character's off field, you get an extra 12% attack. So if instead of this attack you get from Staff of Homer, I look at Emily's base attack, which is 943 times 0.24, and you can see there 226. So I'm actually getting about 40 extra attack, which is not big, but it's no joke. It's very similar to like 1 extra attack percent substat. And then on top of that, the buff that you get from being a healer, that means it's not just strong for Escoffier, but if we look at the rest of our roster, who else is a healer here? Eon-san, Chevreuse, and Mika. These can all utilize this polearm. And then on top of that, characters like Xiangling can snapshot the attack buff, which means Chevreuse can use it in a team like this. Although I was doing some testing, because of the way Cloran's healing works, she converts healing received into Bond of Life. So we were talking about it in stream. It is likely that it will still count as healing Cloran, so she will get the buff. It's not guaranteed until we see in the game. If you're playing Raiden, she could benefit. If you're playing Mavuika, she would benefit. Usually using Favonius Lance, which is very nice. It gives some energy, but if you could have the opportunity to get extra attack buffs, you would take it. Same thing with Eon-san in a team like this. A lot of people used Favonius Lance on her, but if you could get the attack buffs, you would take it. Although one downside of this weapon is that the buff only lasts 3 seconds. What does that mean is that she only has team-wide healing for her first burst hit, which means the buffs to your off-field characters are temporary. It will only last 3 seconds. So it's not a permanent team-wide 32% attack buff, don't misunderstand. But it's still a very nice polearm. Me personally, I think I'm going to get it. It's very rare that we get strong support weapons like this, and the fact that it works with a bunch of other characters, not just Escoffier, is very helpful. Let's be honest, characters like Escoffier, Eon-san, Chevreuse, these are some of the strongest supports in the game, so buffing them is incredible. As for her artifact sets, this is very straightforward. The meta just seems to be Golden Troop on Escoffier. Her personal damage is just so good that you don't want to lower it to give a team buffing set. Instead, stuff like Tenacity or Noblesse, give it to the teammates. Like I said, unless you're playing freeze teams with like Farina and Yelan, double Hydra teams like this, Furina's damage is very sacrificable. She's having the least impact in these teams, which means putting tenacity on her is definitely a good shout. And it's even the case to where you can put Favonius on your Furina, or even like Freedom Sworn on your Furina. If that means you can put more offensive polearms on Shenhe and Escoffier, I think that's going to be worth it. For the DPSs, for example, your Ayaka doesn't have to use Blizzard Stray anymore, because if you're playing with Furina, you can use Marechaussee Hunter. Now technically, in its optimal conditions, Blizzard Stray is just better than Marechaussee Hunter, because you get 15% cryo versus this is just normal and charge attack 15%. And this is at max 36% crit rate versus Blizzard Stray, which is 40. However, if you're playing her with Furina, this would be universal. It would always work, whereas Blizzard Stray is conditional upon enemies being afflicted by cryo or frozen. But having said that, Marechaussee Hunter, you might not always get the stacks. So for example, if you only manage to get 2 stacks on Ayaka, you get 24% crit rate. At that point, it's very similar to Blizzard Stray without the freeze, 20% crit rate, but then you always get this cryo damage bonus. So overall, I mean, use what you have. If you have good Blizzard Stray pieces, use those. If you have good Marechaussee Hunter pieces, or you just want to cover all your bases, get a more universal set, then use those, whatever you have. Same goes for Ganyu and most older characters. They can either use Blizzard Stray or Marechaussee Hunter. Obviously, if you're playing Wriothesley, he was already using this, so you just keep using that. Same thing with neuvillette. And yeah, the meta with Shenhe is very interesting, because it seems that mix sets are going to be even stronger now than they were before. You still could use Noblesse, and I haven't calced it myself, but Fields crafting wise, it does seem to be the case where if you're playing these triple cryo teams, quills are just so much stronger in these new teams than our old teams, to where you do want to maximize this, even if you're losing out on Noblesse buffs. And you get more flexibility as well, because Noblesse is only 12 seconds. As we were talking about earlier, cryo cup versus attack cup on Escoffier, it does seem to be, I would rather use a cryo cup if you do have it. You can see here the damage here is 15.5k with a cryo cup. If you're using attack cup, it can drop to 14.7, but that's assuming equal substats. So me personally, I'm going to maximize my damage, and I'm going to use this for a very small healing decrease. Those are the pros and cons. You can pick whichever one you want. Just make sure you're using a golden troop set. Just make sure you're using that. The only thing with this golden troop set is that it buffs her elemental skill damage a lot, but it doesn't buff her burst. So although her burst is a really big multiplier normally, it's not going to be buffed from our artifact set. Lastly, teams, obviously she benefits really well with Ayaka. You can technically play a wide variety of teammates, but there is a clear premium team, which is going to be Ayaka, Shenhe, Furina, Escoffier. If you're a Wriothesley main, you might also be interested in how he works. It seems to be very good. The debate seems to be, do you play Shenhe or do you play Yelan? And again, like we've been saying for this whole video, Shenhe is going to be a massive damage increase over what she normally does. She will increase your Wriothesley's damage a lot, and like I calculated in my previous video, without Shenhe, Wriothesley's damage is going to plummet. But with someone like Yelan, Wriothesley would be more like a driver. But whether you're trying to maximize Wriothesley's damage or you're playing him more like a driver, the teams might be overall very similar. It's just different play styles. So it comes down to your preference, or it might even just come down to which one you have. Use whoever you have. If you don't have Shenhe, play Yelan. Should be an upgrade in your team? It depends. Like for example with Ganyu, she's definitely going to be an upgrade in Ganyu's freeze teams. But will it be stronger than your Melt Ganyu if she's well invested? It's really hard to say at the moment. Same thing with your Wriothesley. Now what is interesting on the Hydro side is Escoffier should also be very good for characters like Kokomi or Ayato, because these are the characters where before we were playing them in mono Hydro teams, something like this or something like this. Siege Rin as well can work, but as I showed earlier, Escoffier has similar buffs to your Shilonen or your Kazuha, but she's actually doing damage. So she should be a big increase in teams like this. So yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. I will put the link to the original sources in the description if you do want to check those out. If you're going to pull Escoffier, hopefully you've got enough pulls or you get lucky. See you next time. Thanks for watching.